The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
We're going to talk about contract negotiations, everyone's favorite stage of the contracting process, I am sure. It's super quick, fast, expedient, efficient, excellent. I'm running out of E-words to use for how efficient and effective these processes are. They never slow down. They never get bogged down. They never become an issue. They're always great. But maybe we should rethink a few things about them, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So here's what we're going to do. The topic itself is after you have picked a new supplier, a new vendor, whoever has been the most competitive or the top evaluated respondent to your RFP, that's the next step we're going to talk about here as we bring them into negotiations. So we're going to talk about that time period from when you've made that selection to when you're going to get that contract signed. So you're usually down to the one, unless you're in a slightly different type of RFP scenario where you're looking for a multiple award. But for the general, most common type of RFP with one contract to be signed at the end, what are we doing between finding that vendor who's won and then inviting them forward into this stage? And what should we be doing as procurement professionals during this stage, recognizing that we're not the legal experts oftentimes who are hashing out the T's and C's. So we'll go through a quick update or make sure we're aligned on what the negotiation phase even is, and we'll talk about what to focus on for the rest of the session from there. Just start adding our 2 cents to the mix. So what is this negotiation phase? Let's start out with that. Most RFPs have something like this. Once the proposal is due, and I know you're probably not using the old-fashioned hard copy manila envelope submissions, but you get the point here. It might be coming into your e-procurement system or something else. Once the proposal is in hand, you make sure everything is responsible. You go through some type of evaluation process. Usually for larger RFPs, you've got some type of written evaluation of the vendor's written submissions, and then maybe some interviews or presentations or product demonstrations, whatever the case may be. And then we're talking about that next phase at the end where you've gone through that full evaluation process, you've narrowed down to the one vendor or supplier, and you're inviting them forward into contract negotiations, and signing that contract will happen at the very, very end. So just looking at this phase here for negotiations, we're going to focus on that for the rest of our time together today. Now, with a traditional negotiation, what we most commonly see during this green time phase here of the negotiation period or negotiation phase, most common thing we see is that the vast majority of the effort spent by the client organization is focused on getting that contract or that agreement signed, right? So what that means is negotiating the legal terms and conditions of that agreement, maybe fleshing out the scope or a statement of work, but that might be inconsistently done from a project to project basis because it depends upon your individual project teams and how engaged they are as the subject matter experts around that scope. And we see little effort spent on clarifying or pre-planning how that contract is going to operate is what we tend to see. So another way to say this is you have 2 parallel streams of activities that occur during this phase. You've got the normal piece, which is the legal agreement, terms and conditions, getting the actual contract details ironed out and signed. Often that becomes the top priority of where our teams spend their time during this phase. And what we're going to argue for here today is that there's a parallel stream of activities called clarifying or more detailed planning. And this is where us as procurement professionals and our individual project teams should be focusing. So that's the argument that we are going to make. And so when we say that we're going to focus on some clarification and detailed planning activities during this phase, what is it that we should be focusing on is the question. So here's the overall philosophy, and then we'll get into more specifics after that. So the way that we look at it is like this. if your greatest concern when you're signing a new contract, if your greatest concern is that, hey, this might go to court, and so therefore we need a perfect contract, we need to make sure all these terms and conditions are all ironed out so that when we go into court, it's an ironclad, case for us to win as the clients, then yeah, maybe we should be spending all our time on those terms and conditions. But I think most of us are more concerned about actually having that supplier or vendor deliver a successful project for us. And in that case, we should be planning out how that execution work is going to go and make sure that it is seamless. And that's something we should be looking ahead at, because before you sign that contract is the best time and most accountable time for your vendors to lay out their actual approach and plan in greater detail. Then you can hold them accountable to that if you insert that to the contract as an extra exhibit. And we'll talk about how to do that here in a moment. So in other words, we are not saying that the contract itself is unimportant or that you shouldn't negotiate the contract or you shouldn't try to have solid terms and conditions. All of that does need to be done. We're not denying that. But as a client organization, we should be doing a little bit more work to maximize the opportunity for success. I'm bobbing my head to avoid the words. I don't know if that works though. So we want to focus on this clarifying and detailed planning activities during the contract negotiation process in parallel with that legal agreement, getting the terms and conditions signed. That's all still happening. And usually that takes a decent chunk of time, depending upon how our legal team is in terms of their volume and capacity, how complex the project is, and so forth. While that is happening, we're recommending that us in procurement and our individual project teams that we are facilitating through the procurement process, we should really be focusing on some clarification activities. And we're going to talk about that planning or clarifying now. So what does this mean? What does this entail? I mean, one way to look at it is, using an analogy, no one's going to argue that eating healthy or exercising is bad for you. It's just that actually doing it day in and day out and doing it consistently, that's tough for all of us. We have busy lives. Similarly, pre-planning a little bit further on our projects, no one's going to say that trying to plan ahead is a bad thing. But the reality is that we see most clients do in fact struggle with doing this on a consistent basis. It's a very real struggle. So we're going to keep this in mind as we walk through it, that it's going to seem a little bit simple, but actually following through and doing this on a project by project or RFP by RFP basis can sometimes be imperfect. But we're not trying to be perfect here. We're trying to be consistent and do this effectively, but it can be challenging to implement. So our overall goal with whatever new project is we want that project to come in on time, if it's a time duration type of projects, or we want our annual rotation of activities or regular rotation to come in on a timely basis, if it's more of a service-oriented RFP. We want to be on budget. We want good quality service. That's what we're looking for. In other words, we want to really avoid any surprises that could happen after the contract signature. And I'll use a picture that we use all the time, one of our favorite pictures, right? That can spend all the time in the world on detailing out that perfect contract, get those requirements just right. But if we've got the wrong team doing the work or we haven't planned ahead for exactly how this is going to happen, then our chances of being surprised at the outcome will go up. So let's talk about surprises for a moment. What could cause a surprise in the midst of a project being delivered for our organization? Well, of course, if we get deviations to the cost or the time, if there are gaps in our scope or requirements or our expectations aren't being met, something that is being delivered isn't working as intended, it's not what we were expecting, or if the vendor is asking us as the client organization to do something we weren't anticipating during the project, all of that can be a challenge. And any other type of incorrect or misplaced assumptions, any of these things that pop up during the execution of a project or new service can cause us to be surprised, and often those surprises lead to not being as happy. So what should we be clarifying to plan ahead to minimize the chance of those types of surprises? We would recommend that at a core basic level, there are 5 main things to be looking at. I'll run through each of them quickly here. So first up is a cost verification. Ask your vendor, and again, this is the vendor or supplier that has already been evaluated. They're the top ranked. You've got them in contract negotiations. And this might be actually somewhat overlapping with the contract negotiation process here, but you want them to walk through their cost proposal again. Make sure that they really walk you through it and you understand what's going on. Understand any unit costs or underlying cost drivers so you know where the levers are. Ask any questions if something's not clear or if you need additional details. Now's the time to get those before that contract is signed. And maybe consider 2 or 3 of the biggest what if scenarios. Hey, what if this happens? What if that happens? How does it affect the costs? And usually we can foresee those couple of things that might happen, and we can have that conversation now before the contract is even signed, because it's never fun to do that during the contract's execution, while things are supposed to be happening, activities are supposed to be occurring. Maybe people are waiting on things. It's nice to know in advance and minimize the surprise. If you know of a potential what if scenario now, then now during contract negotiations is the time to ask about that. Number 2, aligning expectations. Sounds a little squishy, so let's talk about it. What this really means is you want to walk through the scope and requirements in the same way that you walked through the cost. Have the vendor go through that with you. Also ask them to generate a list of things that are not included in their scope, so you can understand the boundary lines of where they're not expecting things to be included versus excluded. And you're doing this to make sure that your understanding of your scope is the same as what they understood when they were preparing their proposal response, because they were doing that in their home office without much interaction with you, unless they lobbed in some questions that all their competitors got to see as well. So there wasn't really a dialogue there that happened during the RFP process. Well, now, during the negotiation phase, there can be a little bit more conversation to make sure that we are fine-tuned in alignment about what is in, what is out, where is that boundary line. It's never fun to be surprised later on when the vendor's like, that's not included. And you're like, well, I thought it was. And then let's go back and look at the scope, and that scope wasn't perfect, and so on and so forth. The other big thing to ask them is, what is it that they expect you as the client to perform? Really, you as your client team. There's usually not too much that they want us in procurement to do, but our project teams that we are helping through the negotiation process, our project managers, our funding groups, the budget holders, and so forth, and maybe some end users. What is the vendor expecting that they're going to do during the project? We want to know about that now, so it's not a surprise later, and the vendor is not then waiting on the client to react or do what they're supposed to do or what the vendor was needing, because the longer you make the vendor wait, then the greater chance of having some type of change order conversation later. Then anything else that you think is more unusual or unique or different in your requirements, that separates your organization and your service that you're asking for from just the average that your vendor would typically see. Now's the time to make sure that they clearly understand that. Again, just one last check. Hopefully they do. Hopefully you made that clear during the RFP process itself, and all of the vendors who are proposing were clear on those things. But if there is anything else that's a little bit different than and out of the ordinary, just double check it now, because it's harder to do so after the contract has been signed. Next up is a client schedule. This is not your project schedule. Of course, you'll probably have that as part of your contract negotiation, but the client schedule is really the most helpful thing you can do on a larger or more complex project to understand specifically what is expected of the client group and when, in order to help or support that vendor. So is that access or information or review periods? Are there any other activities that you're supposed to be doing with that vendor during the project's delivery where you need certain people to be available? All of those types of things are what we are referring to. So get those items or tasks that are required from the clients. Make sure those roles and responsibilities are understood. Put some specific due dates in there and an actual point of contact within your client organization who's responsible for that thing, who has been a part of the conversation, who has acknowledged what that task is, what their role and responsibility is, and said, yep, that makes sense, and I can do it by that point in time. That's the type of conversation you're trying to drive to. So it could be as simple as this, a few items. Who's the lead point of contact by name within your client group, and what are those dates? And they've had a chance to have that conversation and say, yes, that seems reasonable and achievable for us. Number 4 out of 5 here, a risk mitigation plan. So what we mean by this is any potential issues, concerns, risks, challenges, even intuitions or suspicions of something that could go wrong or unexpected or be uncovered. Now's a good time to chat about those. Hey, vendor, if this happens, what are we going to do? How would we handle it? How do we respond? You can just pose those questions to the vendor now. You can just ask them, what would we do? If this thing happens or if that thing happens, what would we do? What is your recommended solution? And it's a good way to confirm their understanding of things as well. Again, another time to check anything that's unique or different about our projects. And the goal here is not just to say who's paying for it if something is happening. Like that's what is traditionally known in project management circles as risk transfer, right? Well, hey, if this thing happens, vendor, you're paying for it, or are we paying for it, or how much? That's not really what we mean. We mean more of the step-by-step. If this thing happens, who does what and when and how are we responding? That's more of what the plan should be than just trying to divvy out who's on the hook for it. That's more of a contractual thing. And then last but not least is any other critical documentation. So, do you want more of a layout of that project approach or how that service approach is going to be? Anything else on a staffing plan, any org charts, other structural things, any other documentation from them? You want to recheck things about their key personnel, could be security plans, subcontractor plans, et cetera. Basically, what you're probably getting out of this is like, hey, some of these things sound like the things that we would ask for as a part of our RFP. One thing that CPE recommends is try to minimize any extra paperwork that you're asking the vendor or supplier community to submit during the RFP process. You want to keep that as light as possible so they're focused on putting their best foot forward in pricing and project approach planning and resourcing your proposal response, not just filling out paperwork. So the classic example that's very controversial that probably 75% of the room will disagree with us on, but just to paint the picture for you is like, any type of security requirements for an IT software projects. A lot of times we have these big, long security questionnaires and things like that we want to make sure that the vendors are meeting. Otherwise, we're not going to consider their software products. We actually recommend that gets held back out of the RFP and published later. There's different ways that you can do that. But most of the time, you don't need every single possible vendor to fill that out now up front, but you can get it later in the negotiation phase. So it's all on record prior to signing the contract. It's one of those things where it speeds up the 90% of RFPs where it's not an issue. And then those other 10%, you've got a proper protocol to deal with it. So that's basically our thinking there. So those are the 5 things we'd recommend clarifying prior to signing the contract. How do we actually do all of that? It might sound like a lot of things to do. So there's a bit of a process or procedure to go about this. It's really a 3-step approach. So we'll go through each of them. First is the notification. So once you're done with your evaluations, you've identified the top ranked vendor who you want to invite forward into the contract negotiation phase. Then you're notifying them, but you're not just notifying them the happy news of congratulations, you've won the competition. It's you are the top evaluated vendor. You are potentially selected. And then you go ahead and say, here's other things we want to clarify in parallel to our contracting process. So yeah, we're going to work on the contract just like any other project, but at the same time, let's spend some time pre-planning together. And then you also hit them right away with your major issues, concerns, or questions you have about their proposal or anything you've learned during the proposal process. How are you handling this? Maybe hit them with a few of those what if scenarios. Hey, we know we want to talk about these things. Be ready. And so send that to them in writing in your notification letter, and then follow that up with a phone call to make sure they understand. It might even take a couple phone calls where you're dealing with their initial point of contact, and then you're getting together with their key project team individuals who will be part of that planning process itself and make sure they're understanding of your expectations too. A lot of times they get a notification letter. It has a bunch of stuff in there. It's like, yeah, let's just get the contract negotiated. So you want to help them verbally understand that you want a little bit more. Number 2 is then have a kickoff meeting shortly thereafter. This is a time for both teams, client and vendor, to come together and discuss the project in greater detail. Again, keeping in mind that the whole RFP process typically is not a free-flowing conversation, right? It's much more formal. At this point in time, you have the ability for more discussion. And your real goal at the kickoff meeting is to just confirm that your vendor is the solid partner that you thought they were from the evaluation process, and make sure that you have no other major deal breakers or concerns that could cause this negotiation to go sideways. If you leave the kickoff meeting with that confirmation, then you've done your job. And the next step is to go through those 5 points of clarification that we brought up earlier on the slides. You're kind of ironing out those details as the image shows here. We do recommend that it's documented in a written format, in a written documentation format. So you got the 5 things here illustrated in our document. And then you bring that forward to a final meeting where you review that document together. You confirm that everything on the contractual workflow has happened according to the needs and the timeline. and you're ready to sign at the end of that. And then your contract now is awarded, and it's time to put our signatures on there, and you can attach that clarification document as an exhibit or an appendix to the contract itself. So all of that work that was done in here to clarify some things and pre-plan those 5 items, that's now memorialized as a part of the contractual documents themselves. And that is very nice to increase the level of accountability going forward into execution of the work. And again, this is all happening in parallel with contract negotiations. So if that takes some amount of time for some of your projects where you're hashing out the contract details, then you're just doing these 3 steps in parallel with that. So it should not cost you any more time. It is a little bit of effort to have these conversations, but this effort pays dividends downstream by avoiding those surprises that might come up later. So again, back to our original view of the 2 work streams. You've got the legal agreement, terms and conditions, having the lawyers hash it out, and whatever involvement we need to have there. That's normal. And then on top of that, the clarification and planning that we just walked through and recommends. I'll kind of redraw it here. It's just those 3 steps happening in parallel with the legal terms, conditions being negotiated out. And it all arrives at the contract at the end. And you take that clarification, the ironing out of the details document, and put that into your contract as well. And that is our recommendation. And we'll be curious to hear your thoughts in the virtual peer groups of if that seems reasonable, how does that align with what you're already doing, and so forth. So in summary, to wrap this all up, that negotiation period is the final step in the selection process, right? We've already identified, we've already gone through all those steps of doing your evaluations, and then you're down to that last piece before you get to the contract award. The negotiation period should be more than just the terms and conditions of the contract agreement. You should use some of this time to plan ahead and do those 5 areas of cost verification, aligning your expectations around the scope, getting a schedule of what's expected of that client team during the project execution phase, doing a risk mitigation walkthrough, and any other critical documentation you need to have on hand to be comfortable in signing that contract. That's what we are recommending. So again, there's your steps, but this last green spot here is the final step where you can plan ahead with that vendor before you sign the dotted line, because we all know how frustrating it can be to have to go back and change something formally in the agreement. So do it up front, plan ahead, and then smooth sailing is anticipated.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.